In this installment, we continue following our protagonist, and for those who have not seen the first episode, I will give you a brief but clear context so you can enjoy this summary without needing to follow the entire story from the beginning. Something important about this series is that although there is an overall plot, each episode presents a different case, with new threats and new characters. John is a veteran of the United States Army Paratrooper Brigade. He was a highly trained soldier who participated in high-risk operations, which made him lethal, but also deeply marked by his past. After leaving the service, his life went downhill. He lost his direction, his purpose, and ended up wandering the streets as a homeless man, completely disconnected from the world. Sometime later, his fate changes when he is recruited by Harold, a billionaire genius who developed a machine for the government capable of predicting violent acts through massive data analysis. Although it was originally created to prevent terrorist attacks, Harold now uses it in secret to save ordinary lives. The machine identifies people involved in future crimes, either as victims or perpetrators through their social security numbers, but it never specifies which one they are, leaving everything in their hands. In this case, the machine points to a man named Samuel. He is someone with a seemingly stable life. He was born south of Boston, studied law in New York, and currently lives on the west side of the city with his son Sam. However, his story is marked by a recent tragedy. His wife was diagnosed with an inoperable brain tumor in April, and after months of struggle, she passed away in November. Since then, his son has become the only thing he has left, his only reason to keep going. The child's nanny, Christina, came into their lives during his wife's illness. She was hired to help at home, but over time she developed a close relationship with the boy. She spends many hours taking care of him, and that constant contact has created a strong emotional bond, almost like family. Samuel works as a judge in the New York criminal court, and that completely changes the picture. In theory, based on the initial information, everything indicates that he is the possible victim of the case, not the one responsible. But if the machine has flagged him, it means he is directly linked to a violent event that has not yet happened. The problem is that judges, especially those who are strict with the law, tend to accumulate dangerous enemies. And Samuel is exactly that type of judge, incorruptible, firm, and determined to face organized crime without hesitation. His decisions have affected many powerful people, which has generated multiple death threats. Basically, he has declared war on crime, and that has made him a constant target. The machine created by Harold detects patterns of violence, intentions to kill, but it does not explain the context. That is why John and Harold must investigate from scratch to determine the threat and find a way to stop the event before it happens. Following his classic infiltration strategy, John quickly moves to the judge's offices. With precision and stealth, he manages to access the place without raising suspicion. Once inside, he places a hidden microphone under the desk to monitor conversations and begins creating a backup of the judge's computer, searching for any relevant clue. Meanwhile, he carefully reviews the documents on the desk. Among legal papers and case files, he finds something key: a recent death threat directed straight at Samuel. A couple of hours later, while Samuel stops at a courthouse restaurant, John notices two suspicious men watching him from a distance. Their behavior immediately stands out. When Samuel leaves the restaurant, the men begin to approach little by little, as if waiting for the right moment, so the veteran decides to move closer as well, ready to draw his weapon if necessary. However, one of the men pulls out his phone, and after reading a message, his attitude completely changes. He turns around and throws the phone into the trash without leaving any trace. John notices how strange the move is, picks up the phone and checks the message. Discovering something far more serious than he expected, they're about to kidnap the judge's son. Without wasting time, he heads straight to the judge's house, but when he arrives, he runs into the men right in the middle of Sam's kidnapping. The veteran attacks them without hesitation, and although he manages to take down two of them quickly, a third shoots him point-blank with a pistol. Knowing that the police could arrive at any moment, the kidnappers take no more risks. They get into the vehicle and drive away at full speed with the child. After treating his wound, John tells Harold that the machine was wrong, that the one in danger was the child, not the judge, but Harold replies that the kidnapping is most likely connected to something bigger, that it could just be the first step of a plan that ends with the judge's life. Minutes later, Samuel receives a call from his son, and when he answers, he turns pale upon hearing a man's voice. The man makes it clear that he does not want him to involve the police or federal agents if he tells anyone. His son will pay the consequences. He must stay alert because he will receive another call that same night. After hanging up, the judge quickly tries to contact the nanny, but gets no response. Unable to process what he just heard, completely overwhelmed by the situation, he sits on the stairs at that moment. John approaches and promises that he will bring his son back safe and sound. Samuel, shaken, thinks he is one of the kidnappers and grabs him by the jacket, but John explains that he tried to stop them and arrived too late. Even so, he makes something clear. If the kidnappers called him, it is because they want to negotiate. And as long as his son remains valuable to them, they will not hurt him. When he arrives at his house, Samuel sees his son's backpack lying on the floor. There were a couple of alarms in the rooms, but none of them triggered. He mentions that the nanny was supposed to be with Sam, to which John tells him he did not see her when the men took his son. He asks if he thinks she could be involved in the kidnapping, to which the judge firmly assures that she is not. She loves Sam as if he were her own son. In search of information, John asks if he has had any cases related to kidnapping recently, to which the judge says no. He informs him that he has $300,000 in the bank. If this is about money, he will give them everything he has. Sometime later, when visiting the nanny at her home, John makes a disturbing discovery. The woman has been murdered. The scene is recent and everything points to her being silenced to leave no loose ends quickly. He begins to manipulate the place just enough to avoid trouble with investigators. Meanwhile, he contacts Harold to get more information. Harold explains that the kidnappers contacted the judge using an anonymous voice program, impossible to trace easily. In addition, the phone they threw away was prepaid, with no useful data on the SIM card. The messages are encrypted. He tried to breach the company's security, but without the resources the government once provided him when he created the machine. The task has become much more difficult. John, connecting the dots, tells him that it is very likely the nanny was forced to give the alarm code before being killed. Finally, before leaving the scene, he makes a call to the police from the nanny's house phone so they can find the body and then leaves without a trace. On the other hand, we see Detective Fusco inside the same department where Carter works. Thanks to his position, Fusco acts as an informant for our protagonist, allowing him to stay aware of any investigation that could involve him, even going as far as manipulating evidence to divert attention and avoid being identified. When she notices Fusco snooping through the documents on her desk, Carter begins to question him discreetly. After his recent transfer, she has heard troubling rumors about him, so she does not fully trust him, even so, staying calm. Fusco answers every question carefully, trying not to raise further suspicion and gradually earn her trust. Later, he meets with John and updates him on the situation. Detective Carter is quite upset and determined to investigate him. She even mentions that she regrets not arresting him when she had him in front of her disguised as a homeless man. However, he assures him that he should not worry too much. She is still far from discovering his true identity. John gives him a piece of evidence and asks him to investigate it. In addition, he wants information about recent kidnappings related to ransom. He mentions that the suspects are white men with a military appearance, one of them with long hair almost down to his shoulders. Fusco replies that those types of cases are considered high priority and that if something like that had happened recently, it would have already been reported within the department. While the veteran locates the kidnappers with Harold's help, he informs him that he finally managed to breach the phone company's filter. Even so, the information is limited. The phone was purchased in cash under a false name. However, there is a key pattern. The kidnappers must be operating from some hotel in Brooklyn, since the device registers on the same street every night. Upon entering the property, John moves with stealth and manages to surprise one of the men. After a brief but intense fight, he manages to knock him unconscious. He checks his documents and shares the name with Harold so he can investigate it. Then, while inspecting his torso for tattoos, he discovers several symbols he immediately recognizes. They belong to an Eastern European gang. John has faced them before. They deal in arms trafficking in exchange for illegal substances, but they also carry out kidnappings, especially in Warsaw. Everything indicates that they have now expanded their operations into districts of the United States. Meanwhile, we see the detectives at the nanny's crime scene. According to the building's janitor, he managed to see the supposed killer leaving just when someone called emergency services. However, there is a detail that does not fit. The coroner determines that Christina died at least 2 hours before that call. This leads the detectives to an unsettling conclusion. The person who made the call was not the killer. When one of the officers informs the judge about Christina's murder, Samuel pretends he knows nothing. She was supposed to arrive today to take care of his son, but she never showed up. Now he understands why. His son called him, and he decided to leave work early to be with him. Right now he is playing in his room. When the officer leaves, John asks if he knows the Russian gang SP9, to which the judge asks him to tell him the whole truth. He is trusting his son's life to a stranger. He believes it would be best to ask the police for help. John informs him that he has experience in these types of situations. That is all he can tell him. He asks again about the gang, but the judge assures he knows nothing. At that moment, he receives a call from the Traffickers and asks to speak with his son to make sure he is still alive. The man on the other end agrees and puts the boy on for a few seconds. After hearing his voice and confirming he is fine, the trafficker resumes the call and makes his conditions clear. He needs his help in a case from his court. He must ensure that Angela Markham is set free, or his son will die. After hanging up, Samuel quickly explains the situation. Angela was accused of murder in a parking lot. Although everything suggests it was an accident, she is an account executive who works for a technology company 6 weeks ago. During an office farewell party, she got drunk and ran over an accountant at the exit. The authorities charged her with driving intoxicated, so the case seems quite solid against her. With this information, John reaches a troubling conclusion. Even if the judge follows the orders, it is very likely the kidnappers will try to eliminate both Samuel and his son to leave no loose ends. With that kind of criminals, there is no negotiation, only buying time and looking for an advantage. Samuel tells him the trial will begin in 30 minutes, to which John asks him to delay everything as much as possible to make the kidnappers believe he is cooperating while they find a way to act. Later, when meeting with Harold at the base, he reveals an even more disturbing fact. The gang is no longer a simple street crew. Over time, they evolved into a kind of multinational criminal corporation, operating in at least 18 countries. After organizations like Interpol struck the traditional mafia, they reorganized and came back more prepared. They began hiding their tattoos, adopted military training, and expanded their knowledge in different areas, which allowed them to gain an advantage over other criminal organizations. John asks Harold to investigate Angela and then leaves for a secluded parking lot, where he keeps the trafficker he captured restrained. When he opens the trunk, he confronts him directly and asks if he plans to cooperate. However, the mobster responds with insults, making it clear he has no intention of talking or negotiating. On the other hand, we see Detective Carter advancing in the investigation of the nanny's murder. At that moment, Fusco receives a call from John, who asks him for information about the evidence he left him. The detective replies that there is nothing registered in the system, but he is convinced that Carter is working exactly on that scene. Based on the type of evidence John asked him to analyze, everything points to the bullets that hit the wall during the murder. Fusco comments that as soon as he manages to identify the person responsible, he will pass all the information immediately. Before hanging up, John gives him one last instruction. He needs him to keep Carter out of his way. Fusco returns to the detective and she shares her initial hypothesis. She thought the crime could be revenge over a romantic issue, but something does not fit. The scene is too clean, too calculated. Fusco, analyzing the details, adds that the wounds on the body were made with a silenced weapon, which reinforces a clear idea. It was not something emotional, it was a professional job. After driving wildly across a dirt field for several minutes, our protagonist pressures the trafficker again. He opens the trunk and asks him once more if he still thinks the same. To break him, he shows him a hamburger and tells him he can have it. But only if he cooperates. Otherwise, he can stay locked for another 4 hours in that confined space. The trafficker, visibly affected, finally gives in. He assures he does not have much information, since they work in small cells and each member uses nicknames to avoid compromising the others. Even so, he provides some coordinates and explains that in that place is where they receive payments. John thanks him, and as a minimal reward, he throws the hamburger onto his chest before closing the trunk again, leaving him trapped once more. Meanwhile, in court, Harold manages to infiltrate and access Angela's phone information. For his part, the judge decides to postpone the case, arguing that the opposing lawyer is not prepared, so they will resume the trial the next day at 10 in the morning. However, this decision does not go unnoticed. Shortly after, the trafficker contacts Samuel again, annoyed, demanding that he stop delaying the process. The judge, trying to remain calm, explains that everything is part of his plan if he acts too quickly. The prosecutor could appeal the decision, assign another judge, and completely ruin the chance to free Angela. As night falls, the veteran heads to the indicated location, and upon entering to investigate, he moves cautiously through the shadows. Suddenly, one of the kidnappers crosses his path and tries to shoot him, but narrowly misses. John reacts instantly and shoots him in the torso, demanding information about the boy, but the trafficker claims he knows nothing. Without wasting time, John knocks him unconscious with a strike from his weapon, breaks one of the doors, and discovers a large amount of cash. Within minutes, the head of the operation receives the news. 2 of his men have disappeared and someone has stolen $500,000 from them. It becomes clear that someone is interfering with their plans. Furious, he orders his men to investigate immediately. After bringing the money to the base, Harold reveals a key discovery to John. Angela has ties to the mafia. The technology company she works for develops programs for banks, specifically systems capable of detecting possible money laundering operations. In 2009, she supervised the installation of one of these systems in one of the most important banks in the world. If she still has access, she could disable it from her own computer. In other words, the mafia has been using one of the largest banks in the world to launder money without leaving a digital trace. Thanks to that, they can move large amounts without raising suspicion, buy properties, and even pay lawyers to get them out of trouble. If John and Harold managed to access those accounts, they would have a bargaining chip strong enough to negotiate and rescue Sam. Desperate about the situation, the judge tells John that the kidnappers are pressuring him more and more, and that he can no longer keep delaying the case. He even starts to think that if he follows their orders, maybe they will return his son safe and sound. John stops him immediately and makes something clear. The moment he acquits Angela, they will eliminate both of them to leave no loose ends. Even so, he promises once again that he will save his son, but for that he needs him to trust him. Despite the warning, Samuel makes a risky decision and delivers the verdict that same afternoon. He argues that the parking lot recording could unfairly influence the jury against Angela. Faced with this, the opposing side tries to nullify the trial immediately, but Samuel stands firm and responds bluntly, making it clear that his decision is already made. On the other hand, we see Harold infiltrated in the bank with a fake identification. He manages to access a computer and begins reviewing confidential data in front of one of the employees, who becomes suspicious upon seeing him. However, Harold remains calm, and to divert attention, he says that the system was breached and that he was called to fix it, assuring that he will be the temporary replacement. Later, our protagonist continues pressuring the traffickers in search of information. He removes the restraints from one of them and promises to set him free if he manages to get information from his partner without hesitating too much. The man begins to brutally beat the other, showing how far they are willing to betray each other. Returning to the detectives, Fusco informs Carter that he found something relevant in the recordings. Apparently, a warehouse near the nanny's house had a camera connected to the police surveillance network. Right at the moment of the homicide, they captured a suited man with long hair removing his gloves. Fusco traced the vehicle's plate, but instead of a name, he found a company registered in Brooklyn, so now they must investigate that place immediately. After beating his partner until he gets the information, John takes him out of the trunk and contacts Harold to ask him to investigate a man named Jarek Koska. According to one of the traffickers, he is the head of the entire organization. Harold begins to dig, and thanks to his infiltration, he discovers that there are no accounts under his name, which confirms that this is a much larger operation than it seemed. In addition, he finds a key detail. Every morning at 5, Angela disables the bank's security system for 3 minutes. In that short window, millions of dollars flow undetected. The mafia is not only laundering its own money, but has more than 100 clients, probably all criminals. If Koska is using a network of shell companies, tracking him could take hours. At that moment, John receives a message from Fusco, who informs him that the nanny's murder is linked to a specific company. John gives the name to Harold, and both discover that this company has an account linked through which a huge amount of money is moved. By analyzing the transactions, they notice it is related to the purchase of boats, planes, and real estate, most of them in New York. Among the properties, there is one that stands out. It was acquired 2 days before Angela's trial began and is located just 10 blocks from the judge's house. Everything points to Sam being held there. Without wasting time, the veteran heads to the location, but upon arrival he discovers that it is a church. The place is empty, and everything indicates that the criminals left just a few hours ago. On the other hand, after leaving the courthouse, Samuel receives a call. The kidnappers give him an address, assuring that there they will return his son safe and sound. Upon hearing this, Harold asks John to follow him. But at that moment, the veteran takes a different route. He intercepts Angela, surprises her by pointing a gun at her, and orders her to get into the vehicle without making noise. When the judge arrives at the meeting point, he comes face to face with Koska, who is holding his son with a gun pointed at his head. He allows him to get closer, giving him the chance to see him one last time, just as he is about to shoot. John appears, bringing Angela as a hostage. At that moment, John begins to recite account numbers and financial movements out loud, revealing extremely sensitive information. He mentions that the previous year Koska laundered more than $400 million for different clients, including organizations such as Mara Salvatrucha, the Sinaloa cartel, and even the government of North Korea. Koska, surprised, immediately understands that only Angela could have known that information. Even so, he responds coldly, assuring that he does not care, and even admits that he was planning to get rid of her in a few days because she was no longer useful. At that moment, he begins receiving multiple messages. Upon checking them, his expression changes. All of his clients' money has been transferred to a foreign account. John makes it clear that he can still recover it, but only if he follows his instructions to the letter. However, the criminal becomes enraged. Instead of negotiating, he orders his men to kill them all. That is when John acts, demonstrating his experience as a veteran. He takes the initiative and neutralizes the mobsters in a matter of seconds, moving with precision and controlled violence.
Pues, ¿está bien? Sí, lléveselo.
On the other hand, the lawyer who handled the case against Angela discovers some documents on her desk. Upon reviewing them, she realizes they are bank statements with multiple financial movements. At first glance, they seem like normal transactions between companies, but upon closer analysis, everything points to transfers used to hide large amounts of money. possibly linked to the laundering that Angela was helping to cover up. On the other hand, we see the detectives arriving at the location where the veteran found the $500,000 in cash. Upon entering the same room, they find several members of the gang tied up and gagged with tape over their mouths. Among them, they manage to identify who appears to be the leader of the organization. On the table, the $500,000 in cash is displayed as key evidence of the case. Some time later, the veteran is seen watching the judge from a distance, observing him while he plays with his son, now safe. After a few seconds, John decides to approach and, with his usual tone, tells him that he normally does not like having contact with people. The judge, still grateful, thanks him for saving his son, but also makes something clear. He does not know exactly what he does or how he operates, although he is sure it is not within the law, and when they find out, there will be no way to protect him. Later, our protagonist meets with Harold at a restaurant. Harold tells him that he heard his entire conversation with the judge, to which John replies that he could be useful to them in the future, just like Detective Fusco. Before leaving, Harold gives him a curious piece of advice: to try his favorite breakfast. More than a simple recommendation, it is a sign of trust. John understands the message. Even the smallest detail can say a lot about a person, and in his case, it could be enough to start an investigation that reveals his identity.